All right, welcome to our explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a source that lays out a pretty stark historical pattern. It's all about what happens when certain movements, which this analysis calls fascist, get into power using democracy, and then, well, they take that democracy apart from the inside. And it kicks off with a claim that is frankly as absolute as it is alarming.
So this is it. This is the core thesis of the whole thing. It's an incredibly bold statement, right? And according to the author, it's not just an opinion. It's what they found after digging through all the historical records. This one idea is the bedrock for everything else we're about to explore. And that brings us to this number, 0. So what does that mean? Well, according to the source material, that is the number of times a fascist government, after winning an election, has ever been voted out of office. The point the author is making is crystal clear. Once that door slams shut, the ballot box isn't how you open it again. And it's not like these are just quick blips on the radar either. Once they're in, they tend to stay in. The author found that the average length of fascist rule is 31 years. So we're not talking about temporary political swings. The source frames these as long-term, generational takeovers.
Okay, so you're probably asking, where's the proof for these pretty huge claims? Well, the source then walks us through several key historical examples to show this consistent pattern, not just of getting power, but of cementing it.
The source points to Germany as a terrifying example of just how fast this can happen. In January 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor through a political deal. Just 1 month later, the Reichstag fire decree basically erases civil liberties. And by June of '34, in the Night of the Long Knives, the Nazis are literally executing the conservative allies who helped them get there in the first place. Think about that. An 18-month sprint from being a political partner to being a prisoner or worse.
And Germany wasn't alone. The source shows that the path to power looked different in different places, but the destination was almost always the same. In Germany, it was backroom political deals. In Italy, the king literally just invited Mussolini to run the government. In Spain, it was a straight-up military coup. But look at the outcome for each. Long-term dictatorships that ended in war, total defeat, or the dictator just dying in his sleep after decades of rule.
And this brings us to this recurring tragic pattern that the source calls the conservatives' gambit. Time and time again, you see established conservatives get worried about socialists or progressives, so they team up with rising fascists, thinking, hey, we can control these guys, they're the lesser evil. According to the author's research, the number of times this strategy actually worked? 0. The number of times those same conservatives ended up jailed, exiled, or killed? Every single time.
So, after laying out this incredibly bleak historical record, the analysis takes a really sharp turn. It starts to ask a crucial question. Yeah, this pattern is consistent, but can we really just copy-paste it onto the modern world, especially onto a global superpower?
And this is where the whole thing pivots. The historical parallels are, well, they're alarming, but the analysis argues that today's world is just fundamentally different. I mean, taking over Weimar Germany or a largely agrarian Spain is one thing, but taking over the most powerful economic and military force in human history, that, the source suggests, is completely uncharted territory.
The argument here is that you're just not comparing like with like. The nations that fell to fascism back in the 30s were often, broken. They were weakened by war, dealing with insane hyperinflation, and their technology was limited. Modern America, on the other hand, it's a nuclear superpower, it has the world's reserve currency, it's got surveillance capabilities that past dictators could only dream of, and it's protected by 2 giant oceans. The source basically says these differences are so massive they might make that old historical playbook totally obsolete.
So, if the old playbook is out the window, what's next? This is where the source shifts from analyzing history to thinking about strategy. It outlines 4 potential responses that it describes as logical, though pretty radical, for this completely unique situation.
Now, it's really important to frame these the way the source does. These aren't predictions. They're not recommendations. They're more of an analysis of 4 different paths of resistance that suddenly become possible in a context that nobody's ever seen before.
So, the first idea is all about economic and political non-cooperation. The thinking goes that states with massive economies, like California and New York, could basically form a bloc. They could work together to just ignore federal laws they disagree with, create their own pacts on things like climate or civil rights, and essentially run their own show. The source even points to history for this, like when northern states just refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Acts before the Civil War.
The second path is a bit more subtle. It's less about formal agreements and more about mass passive resistance. The source uses the term Irish democracy, which is a historical phrase for when people just silently stop cooperating. This isn't about protests in the street, it's about making it impossible to govern. State officials suddenly become incompetent and lose the paperwork, or millions of people coordinate to mess up their tax returns to clog the whole system. The goal is to make authoritarian control just too expensive and too frustrating to even work.
All right, the third option is the big one, secession. But the source presents it as more than just leaving. It's also a powerful negotiation tool. If the economic engines of the country, the so-called blue states, started to seriously plan an exit strategy, holding votes, talking about how to split the debt, the credible threat alone could be enough to force huge changes. The text argues this would flip the Civil War dynamic on its head. This time, it would be the economic powerhouses threatening to walk away.
And the final path laid out is about going global. Individual blue states could start acting like their own countries on the world stage, requesting UN monitors for elections, signing their own international treaties, and setting up their own diplomatic back channels. The whole point would be to isolate the federal government, hit it with international shame, and maybe even sanctions, basically treating it like a rogue state instead of a legitimate government.
So, this entire analysis, from the grim history to the unprecedented modern reality, all builds up to this one final question. It's the ultimate challenge the source leaves us with.
It all really boils down to this fundamental tension. According to the source, one side might seize control of the formal institutions of government, the courts, Congress, the whole shebang. But, the author argues, the opposition holds the majority of the economic power, the centers of culture, and the country's younger, more diverse population. And it's this massive imbalance of power that could open the door for these kinds of unprecedented responses we've just talked about.
And this is the final, provocative question the author leaves us with. It reframes the entire problem. On the one hand, history offers a very clear, very dark warning. But on the other hand, the totally unique circumstances of today might offer a chance to write a completely different ending. The source doesn't give an answer. It just puts the question on the table. Is this going to be a repeat of a story we've seen before, or the beginning of a whole new chapter?